You protected my farm. Now my father says I must marry you," said the farmer's daughter to the Apache. Magnolia Voss stood in the center of her father's house, staring at a man she'd met only once before. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. The man across from her looked equally trapped, his dark eyes fixed on the floor, jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. Her father stood between them, chest puffed with pride, talking about honor and debts and sacred traditions that made no sense to anyone in the room except him. The stranger hadn't said a word since entering. Neither had she, but somehow they both understood they were being forced into something neither of them wanted. And the worst part, no one had asked either of them if they agreed. 3 days earlier, the land had been dying. The drought stretched into its fourth month, turning the soil to dust and the grass to brittle straw. Magnolia worked dawn to dusk, trying to keep the livestock alive, hauling water from the depleting creek until her shoulders screamed and her palms bled. Her father, Sterling Maddock, spent most days staring at the horizon as if willing rain clouds to appear through sheer stubbornness. The ranch hands had left weeks ago, chasing work elsewhere. It was just the two of them now, fighting a losing battle against the merciless sun. Then the riders came. 7 men, faces hidden beneath hats pulled low, approached just after sunset when the heat finally broke into something breathable. Magnolia was closing the barn when she saw them, their horses moving slow and deliberate across the property line. Her stomach dropped. She recognized desperation when she saw it. These weren't drifters passing through. These were men who'd come to take what they needed, whether it was offered or not. She ran for the house, shouting for her father. Sterling emerged with his rifle, but his hands trembled as he raised it. He was 50 years old and exhausted, facing 7 younger men who'd already decided violence was acceptable. The lead rider dismounted, hand resting on the weapon at his hip. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just pointed at the barn, at the small herd of cattle barely clinging to life, and stated his terms. They'd take half the livestock. No negotiation, no payment, just survival. Sterling started to lower his rifle. Magnolia felt her heart crack. Her father was surrendering everything. They fought for reduced to this moment of quiet defeat. That's when the Apache appeared. He came from the direction of the creek, moving so silently that no one noticed until he was already standing between Sterling and the raiders. Tall, broad-shouldered, with long black hair and eyes that seemed to calculate a dozen possibilities in a single glance. He didn't draw a weapon, didn't raise his voice, just spoke a few words in a language Magnolia didn't understand, then repeated them in English with absolute certainty. "Leave now." The lead raider laughed, started to reach for his weapon. The Apache moved faster than Magnolia thought possible, disarming the man and sending him stumbling backward in one fluid motion. The message was clear. The other riders shifted nervously. Whatever they had expected, it wasn't this. After a tense silence that felt like an eternity, they mounted their horses and rode away, throwing threats over their shoulders that everyone knew were empty. Sterling stared at the stranger who just saved everything he owned. Magnolia watched her father's face transform from shock to something else. Something that made her uneasy. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Sterling said, voice thick with emotion. The Apache shook his head. "You owe me nothing. I was passing through, that's all." But Sterling Maddox wasn't a man who accepted help without strings. And in that moment, Magnolia realized her father was about to make a decision that would destroy them all. She didn't know how. Completely. Not yet. The stranger's name was Cale. And 3 days later, Sterling declared that Magnolia would become his wife. Sterling. Maddox made the announcement at dawn, as if timing would somehow make it less outrageous. Magnolia stood in the doorway of the kitchen, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips, while her father explained his decision with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his own judgment. Cale was already there, summoned before Sunrise, standing near the window with his arms crossed and his expression carved from stone. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd entered the room. The words came out of Sterling's mouth like they'd been rehearsed. Debt, honor, tradition, Sacrée obligation. He spoke about how a man must repay what he owes, how some debts transcend money or labor, how the only way to balance the scales was through family, through blood, through marriage. Magnolia felt the walls closing in with every sentence. Her father wasn't asking. He was declaring as if she were livestock, to be traded, property to be transferred from one man's care to another's. She set the cup down before her hands, started shaking visibly. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. No. Sterling blinked as if the word itself was foreign. This isn't a discussion, Magnolia. The man saved everything we have. Our lives, our land. I won't be known as someone who refuses to honor a debt, then pay him another way. She forced herself to meet her father's eyes. Give him half the cattle when the drought breaks. Offer him work, money, anything except me. A man of honor doesn't. I said no. The words came out sharper this time. Magnolia turned to Cale, expecting to see satisfaction or possession or desire in his face. Instead, she found nothing. He was staring past her, jaw set, breathing slow and controlled like a man trying to master his own anger. Sterling's face re-eamed. You'll do as I say. This is final. That's when Cale spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, and completely devoid of emotion. I didn't ask for this. Sterling turned to him, surprised. You saved my daughter's home, risked your life against 7 armed men. The debt belongs to you, not to her, not to me. Cale finally looked at Magnolia, and for just a second, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. They were both prisoners of the same man's pride. I don't want a wife who's being traded like a horse. The comparison hit Sterling like a slap. His mouth opened and closed. Magnolia felt a strange surge of gratitude toward the stranger who just said what she couldn't. But her father wasn't a man who backed down easily. She could see him regrouping, searching for new arguments, new justifications for a decision he'd already made in his mind. You'll both come to understand, Sterling said, his voice hardening. Honor the man's sacrifice. 3 days from now, we'll have the ceremony. That gives you time to accept what must be done. Magnolia's breath caught. 3 days. He was giving them 3 days to surrender to his will. She looked at Cale again, and this time he held her gaze. There was no warmth in his eyes, but there was something else. Determination, resistance, a refusal to be controlled. Her father left the room, believing the conversation was over. But Magnolia knew better. This wasn't over. Not by a long measure. She glanced at Cale one more time before turning away. He was still standing by the window, hands clenched into fists at his sides. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Magnolia realized she wasn't fighting alone. Magnolia found him near the creek just after midday when the sun turned the remaining water into liquid silver. She'd expected anger or resentment, but Cale was simply sitting on a flat rock, staring at the thin stream like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked aloud. He didn't turn when she approached, but his shoulders tensed. He knew she was there. She stopped a few paces away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to maintain distance. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and shared frustration. Finally, she broke it. You could leave right now. Just walk away. He can't force you to stay. Kyle's jaw tightened. Neither can he force you to marry. But here we are. The truth in. Those words settled between them like dust. Magnolia sat down on a nearby rock, keeping space between them, but close enough to see the tension in his hands. The way his fingers pressed against the stone beneath him. She'd come expecting to find the enemy, the man who'd somehow agreed to this arrangement. Instead, she found someone, as trapped as she was. Why did you save us? The question came out quieter then. She intended. You said you were just passing through. You didn't owe us anything. Cale was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight she hadn't heard before. I've seen what desperation does to men. Yvette, watch people take everything from others just because they could, because they were stronger or faster or more willing to hurt. He paused. I still fixed on the water. I wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen again. Again? Magnolia leaned forward slightly, studying his profile. There was a story there buried beneath the careful control. What happened before? His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe your memory that cut too deep to show. Something I couldn't stop. Something that taught me that standing aside makes you just as guilty as the ones who did the taking. Magnolia felt her anger softening, replaced by something more complicated. Curiosity, understanding. This wasn't a man who saved people for glory or gratitude. This was someone running from ghosts, trying to balance scales that could never be even. She recognized that kind of burden. She'd seen it in her own reflection often enough. My father thinks honor means control, she said quietly. He thinks because you save his property, he owns the right to decide both our futures, like we're debts that need settling instead of people who can choose for ourselves. He's wrong. Cal finally turned to look at her, and the directness of his gaze made her breath catch. Up close, she could see details she'd missed before. The scar along his jaw, the way his dark eyes held both strength and weariness, the careful distance he maintained even while speaking honestly. No one should be forced into marriage. Not for honor, not for debt, not for any reason. Then why haven't you left? The question hung between them, sharp and unavoidable. Cale's expression shifted, something almost like a smile touching the corners of his mouth, but without any warmth. Because if I leave, your father will find another way to settle his debt, and you'll end up married to someone who might not care that you don't want it. The realization hit Magnolia like cold water. He was staying to protect her from worse options, from men who might not reject the arrangement, who might see her father's offer as an opportunity rather than an imprisonment. She stared at this stranger who'd become her unwilling protector twice over and felt something shift in her chest. We need to find another way, she said finally. Something that satisfies his pride without destroying our lives. Cale nodded slowly. 3 days? We have 3 days to figure it out. But as Magnolia walked back toward the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that 3 days wouldn't be nearly enough. And, somewhere in the distance, she heard the sound of approaching horses. The horses belonged to neighbors. 3 men from the settlements to the east, their faces sunburned and suspicious as they dismounted near the house. Magnolia watched from the porch as her father greeted them with the forced hospitality of a man who didn't want company but couldn't refuse it. They'd come to see the Apache who'd driven off the raiders. Word traveled fast and empty. Country, carried by wanderers and traders who had nothing better to do than spread stories. Sterling invited them inside for coffee. Magnolia stayed on the porch, and Cale remained near the barn, maintaining the distance of someone who understood he wasn't welcome. She could feel the men's eyes on him, assessing, judging, calculating what his presence meant for their own properties. When they finally left an hour later, their expressions told her everything she needed to know. They didn't trust him, and they didn't like what Sterling had planned. That evening, Sterling insisted Cale take his meals with the family. Another one of his traditions, another attempt to normalize what couldn't be made normal. Magnolia sat the table in silence, placing 3 tin plates and forks with deliberate care. When Cale entered, he moved, carefully like a man walking through a room full of traps. He sat across from her, leaving the head of the table for Sterling. They ate without speaking at first, the scrape of utensils against metal the only sound. Magnolia found herself watching Cale's hands, noticing how controlled each movement was, how he never took more than he needed, how he seemed aware of every inch of space he occupied. There was something deliberate about the way he existed, as if he'd spent years learning to make himself smaller, quieter, less threatening. Sterling broke the silence with questions about tracking and survival, subjects he could discuss. Without addressing the tension that filled the room like smoke, Cale answered briefly, offering just enough information to be respectful without revealing anything meaningful. Magnolia noticed how he deflected personal questions, redirecting conversations away from his past with the skill of someone who'd practiced. After Sterling retired for the evening, Magnolia stayed to clear the table. She expected Cale to leave immediately, but he remained, standing near the doorway with his arms crossed. She could feel his presence behind her, warm and solid and unexpectedly steady. When she turned, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to stay for these meals," she said quietly. "I know it's uncomfortable. Your father would take it as an insult." Cale's voice was low, meant only for her, and that would make things harder for you. The consideration in those words surprised her. He was thinking about her position, her relationship with Sterling, the consequences she'd face if he refused these small rituals. Most men wouldn't have noticed. Most men wouldn't have cared. She set down the plate she'd been holding, turning to face him fully. "Why? Are you really staying?" The question came out softer than before, without accusation, just genuine curiosity. "You said you're protecting me from worse options, but you could warn me and leave. You don't owe us anything." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face like he was trying to decide how much truth to offer. When he spoke, his voice carried a roughness that suggested the words cost him something. "Because I know what it's like to have choices stolen. To wake up one day and realize your life belongs to someone else's decisions." He paused, and for just a second his carefully maintained control slipped. "I won't be the reason that happens to someone else." Magnolia felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. She took a step closer, closing some of the distance between them. Close, enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed slightly at his sides, the barely perceptible increase in his breathing. "Thank you for that." Cale's gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes so quickly she almost missed it. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something neither of them had permission to acknowledge. He took a step back, deliberately rebuilding the distance. "She just crossed. 3 days," he said quietly. "We'll find a solution before then." But as he walked out into the darkness, Magnolia stood in the empty kitchen and wondered if the real problem wasn't the forced marriage itself, but what she was beginning to feel despite it. They returned the next morning, but this time they brought others. 8 men on horseback, their faces hard with the kind of certainty that comes from believing you're protecting something sacred. Magnolia saw them from the window and felt her stomach turn. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an intervention. Sterling met them outside, and Magnolia followed, despite his gesture to stay inside. Cale emerged from the barn, moving with the careful awareness of a man who'd learned to read danger in the posture of others. The lead rider, a thick shouldered man named Garrett, dismounted with deliberate slowness. His eyes never left Cale. "Sterling, we need to talk about what you're planning." Garrett's voice carried across the yard, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The whole territory's heard about this arrangement, and people aren't happy." Sterling's jaw set. "Why do with my family's my own concern, not when it affects all of us." Another man spoke up, younger but equally hostile. "You're setting a precedent here. If you go through with this, what's to stop others from making similar arrangements? We have standards, traditions." Magnolia felt heat rising in her chest. They weren't even trying to hide what this was really about. Not honor or tradition, just plain hatred dressed up in polite words. She stepped forward before her father could respond. "This isn't your decision to make." Garrett's eyes shifted to her, and she saw the condescension there. "You're young, Miss Voss. You don't understand what you'd be giving up, the shame you bring on your family name. There are good men in these settlements who treat you proper, men who belong here, men like you." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't regret them. "Men who think they have a right to tell me who I can and cannot marry." Magnolia. Sterling's warning tone cut through the air. But she wasn't finished. You don't know anything about him. She gestured toward Cale, who stood silent and still, watching the exchange with eyes that revealed nothing. He risked his life to protect us when you and your friend are nowhere to be found. Where were all these concerned neighbors when raiders came to steal everything we owned? The accusation landed hard. Several men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Garrett's face re-eamed. That's different. We would have helped if we'd known. But that doesn't mean it means you have no right to stand here and judge who deserves gratitude and who doesn't. Magnolia's voice shook, but she held her ground. My father made this arrangement. If you have a problem with it, that's between you and him. But I won't stand here and let you insult someone who saved our lives while you did nothing. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Garrett stared at her with something between surprise and fury. Sterling looked torn between pride in her courage and anger at her defiance. But it was Cale's expression that caught her attention. For the first time since she'd met him, something unguarded flickered across his face. Surprise. And something else she couldn't quite name. Garrett remounted his horse, his movements stiff with barely controlled anger. You're making a mistake, Sterling. And when this goes wrong, don't expect help from any of us. He turned his attention back to Magnolia, his voice dropping lower. And you miss Voss, you'll regret this choice. Everyone who crosses certain lines always does. The threat hung in the air as the men rode away, leaving dust and tension in their wake. Sterling turned to Magnolia, his face conflicted. But before he could speak, Cale stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. She shouldn't have had to defend me. This arrangement puts her in an impossible position. She chose to speak. Sterling's voice was rough. That was her decision. A decision she only had to make because of yours. Cale met Sterling's eyes without flinching. How many more times will she have to choose between what's expected and what's right? Sterling had no answer for that. He walked back to the house, shoulders tense with the weight of complications he hadn't anticipated. Magnolia stood, alone with Kyle in the yard, breathing hard from the confrontation, her hands trembling with leftover adrenaline. You didn't have to do that, Kyle said quietly. Magnolia turned to look at him, seeing the careful control back in place, but understanding now what it cost him to maintain it. Yes, I did. And in that moment, she realized the truth that terrified her most. She wasn't just defending him out of fairness or principle. She was defending him because somewhere between forced obligation and shared resistance, she'd started to care what happened to him. But before she could fully process that realization, she heard it. The distant sound of more horses, and this time they were coming faster. The raiders came back with vengeance in their hearts and weapons in their hands. 12 of them this time, faces covered, moving fast across the drought-cracked land just as dusk turned the sky to copper. Magnolia saw them, first from the window where she'd been watching the horizon, her instinct screaming danger before her mind fully processed what she was seeing. She ran for the rifle, shouting for her father and Cale. Sterling emerged from his room, still pulling on his boots. Cale appeared from the barn, already moving with the focused intensity of someone who'd anticipated this exact scenario. The riders split into two groups, one circling toward the house, the other heading for the corral where the few remaining cattle stood. They'd learned from their first defeat. This time they weren't asking, they were taking. The first shots cracked through the evening air, splintering wood from the porch railing. Magnolia dropped to her knees, behind the water trough, heart hammering against her ribs. Sterling returned fire from the doorway, but his hands shook, and his aim was off. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and everyone knew it. Kyle moved like water, fluid, and purposeful, using the barn as cover while he worked his way toward the raiders approaching the corral. Magnolia watched him navigate the chaos with a skill that came from experience from surviving situations exactly like this. One, he wasn't trying to fight them all. He was trying to disrupt their coordination, force them to react, instead of execute their plan. One of the raiders broke away from the group, heading directly for the house. Magnolia raised her rifle, but her hand was shaking so badly she couldn't aim properly. The man was 20 paces away, then 15, then 10. Her finger tightened on the trigger, her breath coming in. Sharp gasps. Kyle appeared from the side, tackling the raider before he reached the porch. They went down hard, rolling in the dust, and Magnolia saw the glint of a blade. She fired without thinking, not at the men, but at the ground near them. The noise enough to startle the raider into loosening his grip. Cale used that moment to disarm him, sending the man scrambling back toward his horse. But the distraction cost them. 3 more raiders converged on the corral, cutting the fence and driving the cattle out. Sterling shouted in rage and desperation, but there was nothing they could do. The animals scattered into the darkness, driven by men who knew exactly what they were. Stealing. Not just livestock, hope, survival, everything Sterling had left. Magnolia ran from the porch toward Cale, who was getting to his feet, breathing hard. Blood streaked his shoulder where the blade had caught him, but he was still moving, still alert. She reached him, just as the last of the raiders disappeared into the distance, their victory complete. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire had been. Sterling stood in the yard, staring at the broken fence and empty corral. His face had aged 10 years and 10 minutes. Everything he'd tried to protect, everything he'd sacrificed his daughter's freedom for was gone. The debt he'd claimed was so sacred had just been paid in the worst possible way with total loss. Magnolia turned to Kyle, seeing the pain in his eyes despite his attempts to hide it. She reached for his injured shoulder. Without thinking, her fingers gentle against the torn fabric of his shirt. He flinched at the touch but didn't pull away. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of fighting battles that weren't his own. Over and over again, "You're hurt," she said quietly. "It's nothing." But his voice lacked conviction. "Let me help." She wasn't asking. She was stating fact. Because in that moment, covered in dust and fear and adrenaline, she realized something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't just defending him out of principle anymore. She was defending him because he'd stood between her and violence without hesitation. Because he'd fought for people who weren't his family, for land that wasn't his home, for a future he'd been forced into against his will. And he'd done anyway. Sterling walked past them, without a word, his shoulders bowed under the weight of failure. The proud man who declared sacred debts and immovable traditions now looked like nothing more than what he was: broken, lost, and finally beginning to understand the cost of his stubbornness. But as Magnolia led Cale toward the house to tend his wound, she heard Sterling's voice from inside, raw with emotion, and she knew that whatever came next would change everything. Magnolia cleaned the wound by lamplight while Cale sat rigid in the chair, jaw clenched against the pain. The cut wasn't deep, but it was long, stretching from his shoulder down toward his chest. She worked carefully, her hands steadier now than they'd been during the attack. Sterling sat at the table behind them, his face buried in his hands, silent. When she finished bandaging the wound, Cale stood to leave, but Sterling's voice stopped him. "Wait." The single word carried more emotion than Magnolia had heard from her father in years. Sterling looked up, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "Sit, please, both of you." They sat. Magnolia felt tension coiling in her stomach, waiting for another declaration, another demand cloaked in honor and tradition. But when Sterling spoke, his voice was different, smaller, human. "I had a daughter before Magnolia." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Magnolia's breath caught. She'd never heard this story, never knew she'd had a sister. Her name was Catherine. She was 17 when she fell in love with a man I didn't approve of. He was a wanderer, a trader who passed through twice a year. Good man, kind, but he had no land, no family name, nothing I thought was worthy of my daughter. Sterling's hands trembled as he continued. I forbade the marriage, told her she'd dishonor the family if she went through with it, that she owed me obedience for everything I'd given her. His voice cracked. She left anyway, married him despite my threats, and I kept my word. I cut her off completely, told her she was no longer my daughter, that she'd made her choice and would have to live with it. Magnolia felt, tears burning behind her eyes. She'd never seen her father like this, stripped of his armor, exposed and raw. 2 years later, I got word she died. Fever took her during a harsh winter. Her husband tried to bring her home, tried to get help from the settlements, but no one would assist him because of me. Because I made it clear anyone who helped them was betraying me. Sterling looked at Cale directly now, his face twisted with old pain. I killed my daughter with my pride, my honor, my traditions, and I've spent every day since trying to prove to myself that I was right, that obedience and debt and family name matter more than choice, more than love. The silence that followed was absolute. Magnolia understood now why her father had been so desperate to control this situation, to make it right through force. He wasn't trying to honor a debt. He was trying to rewrite history to prove that his way worked, that rigid tradition could create happiness if everyone just followed the rules. Kyle spoke quietly, but his words cut clean. You can't fix the past by repeating the same mistake. Sterling flinched like he'd been struck. I know that now. He turned to Magnolia, and she saw genuine fear in his eyes. I can't lose another daughter. But that's exactly what I'm doing, isn't it? I am pushing you away the same way I pushed Catherine away. Try to control something that was never mine to control. Magnolia's voice came out thick with emotion. I'm not asking you to approve of every choice I make. I'm asking you to let me make choices at all. I was wrong. Sterling's admission came out broken, but sincere about the debt, about the marriage, about thinking I could force honor into existence through obligation. He looked at Cale again. You owe us nothing. You saved our lives. You fought beside us tonight, and I've repaid that by trying to take your freedom. I'm sorry for all of it. Kyle nodded, slowly, accepting the apology without words. But it was Magnolia who spoke. Next, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. The ceremony tomorrow. You'll cancel it? Yes. Sterling's shoulders sagged with relief and exhaustion. I'll tell anyone who asks that I was wrong, that you both are free to make your own decisions. No obligations, no debts. The weight that had been pressing down on the room for days suddenly lifted. Magnolia felt like she could breathe again. Cale stood, preparing to leave now that the conversation had reached its conclusion. But Magnolia's hand shot out, catching his wrist before he could step away. He looked down at her, surprised. Wait, she said quietly. Don't go. Not yet. Because freedom meant something different now. It meant having the right to choose. And as she looked at Cale, standing in her father's kitchen with a bandaged wound and exhaustion in his eyes, she realized she wanted to make a choice. Sterling hadn't anticipated, one that had nothing to do with debt or obligation or forced arrangements. She wanted to choose this man on her own terms. Sterling left them alone in the kitchen, retreating to his room, with the weight of his confession still heavy on his shoulders. The lamp flickered between Magnolia and Cale, casting shadows that danced across the walls. She still held his wrist, her fingers warm against his skin, and he hadn't pulled away. The silence between them felt different now. Not uncomfortable, not obligatory, just honest. You're free to leave, Magnolia said quietly, finally releasing his wrist. No debt, no arrangement. You can ride out tomorrow morning and never look back. Kyle studied her face in the lamplight, his dark eyes searching for something she couldn't name. Is that what you want? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Neither of them had permission to speak aloud before. Magnolia took a breath, gathering courage that had nothing to do with facing raiders or standing up to neighbors. This was different. This was choosing to be vulnerable when she didn't have to be. No, the word came out steadier than she expected. I don't want you to leave, but not because my father demanded it. Not because of honor or debt or any of those things he tried to force on us. She met his gaze directly. I want you to stay because somewhere Between being trapped together and fighting together, I started to see who you actually are. And I want the chance to know more. But only if you want that too. Kale's expression shifted. The careful control he maintained so constantly finally cracking. She saw the war happening behind his eyes between. The instinct to protect himself by leaving and the desire to stay for something real. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he'd been holding back for days. I've spent years avoiding connections, avoiding places where I might have to care what happens to people. Because caring means losing. Eventually, it always does. He paused, and she could see how much the admission cost him. But when those men attacked tonight, all I could think about was keeping you safe. Not because I owed your father, not because of any obligation, because the thought of something happening to you made me forget every lesson I'd learned about staying distant. Magnolia felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. So stay. Not forever if you don't want to. Not with promises neither of us is ready to make. Just stay long enough to see what. This could be when it's our choice instead of someone else's demand. Kyle raised his hand slowly, his fingers brushing against her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he was capable of. I don't know how to do this, how to be something other than alone. Neither do I. Magnolia leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. But I'd rather figure it out together than spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been if we'd been brave enough to try. For a long moment, they stood there in the lamplight, close enough that she could count his breaths. Feel the tension in his body slowly releasing. Then Cale leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and she felt him exhale like a man finally setting down a burden he'd carried too long. I'll stay, he whispered. Not because I have to, because I want to. And in that simple declaration, everything changed. The obligation that had hung over them, like a storm cloud dissolved, replaced by something infinitely more powerful. Choice, freedom, the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of building something real from the ruins of what had been forced. 3 months later, when Magnolia stood at a simple altar, they'd built together near the creek, wearing a dress she'd chosen herself, with neighbors who'd learned to see past their prejudice watching quietly. She looked at Cale and saw not the man who'd been forced to marry her, but the man who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. Sterling stood beside them, older and humbler, having learned that true honor wasn't found in rigid tradition, but in respecting the people you loved enough to let them choose their own path. The ceremony was simple, built on words that meant something, because they came from freedom rather than obligation. And when Cale took her hand, his grip steady and sure, Magnolia understood finally what her father had taken years to learn, that the strongest bonds weren't forged through debt or duty or forced arrangements. They were built slowly, painfully, honestly by two people brave enough to choose each other when they didn't have to, when the choice itself was the entire point. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.